Okay. Hi, everybody. It's Debra and Peter again doing our podcast. Hi, Peter. What have you been doing? What have you been up to?
Hi, Deborah. Yeah, good, thanks. Really at the kind of when are we going to exchange contracts? When are we going to complete high stress stakes around our house move, which is kind of in some ways drowning out anything and everything else. Getting to grips with Five Rights Foundation, being a chair, having meetings with my fellow trustees, which is a challenging thing to do because they are in different time zones, in different countries, and but united in what we're trying to achieve. So that's been fascinating. How about you?
Yeah, look, I had a busy week. I was up at the charity awards last week, which was always good fun and very, very, very moving. And Oxfam won the overall award, which normally it gets most of the sector like tutting because it's like big charities winning stuff. But
All
actually, it
right.
was thoroughly well deserved. And I think pretty much everybody in the room, even those who are small charity supporters, were like that was entirely the right choice because of this women's fund that they've set up, which is, it's being done very much within the community. So that's quite inspiring. And then there was the most amazing speech given by the chief exec of the Muslim Charities Forum, and Fadi Itani, which had some of us in tears. Yeah, all he was doing was introducing and presenting an award, but being Fadi, he took advantage of the moment to talk about the need for us to come together, to focus on peace. It was absolutely fabulous. And if I could get a transcript, I'd keep it. So, yeah, so it was a very, very good night, very moving.
I saw my dear friend Dame Esther Ranson won the Lifetime Achievement
She
Award.
did, yeah, she did, and her lovely daughter collected it on
Becca.
her behalf. Yeah,
Oh,
and actually,
brilliant.
she was wonderful because she said, "I don't really know much about charities." She said, other than things Mum has done, and she said, "I've sat here listening to all of these, amazing things that these charities have done, and I feel quite humbled, and I realise how incredibly important you are." So
Oh,
it was very much a feel good event.
Rebecca's the acting president of Childline, and she's a Childline volunteer.
Is
She's
she?
amazing. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
She's
yeah.
hiding her light under a bushel a little bit there, I would say.
Well, well.
Anyway,
Anyway, it was very inspiring to hear all that. And there was a message from Esther, I think, as well. So, yeah,
and it's also been the 40th anniversary of Live Aid, hasn't it? Which
it
is a
has.
big moment in UK charity history.
Have you been watching the programme, Peter? On this week I think it's on BBC Two, I can't remember. They're doing a Live Aid at 40. There's 3 episodes, and the last one I think is on Sunday, talking about firstly the record, then the concert, and then I don't know what the third one will be, presumably the aftermath.
I haven't caught it, no, not
Oh,
really.
it's actually wonderful. It's so inspiring. I mean, I ended up having goosebumps again, and it made me think about of course, in the 80s, there was a huge amount of ignorance around. So there was lots of ways in which the thing was done that wasn't handled well. And there was one bit they were interviewing some chap, some senior minister, foreign minister or something in Ethiopia, and he'd got the hump about the fact that. The song was called "Do They Know It's Christmas?" and he kept saying, Ethiopians are Christians. Do you not? Of course, we know it's Christmas. Do you know what I mean? So they got really offended because the song itself had been culturally insensitive.
Right.
Although, having said that, of course, it wasn't. The real lyrics are not about whether they know it's Christmas, that what Christmas is, but this is such a dreadful place. There's no room to even celebrate Christmas. So that was the meaning behind the song, but it
Yeah.
got taken badly. So yeah, so of course there were things that were flawed about it, but for the time, and it was phenomenal. And also, of course, it spawned, there are so many other great charities and fundraising initiatives that have come now as a result of seeing what Bob Geldof did with Band Aid, then Live Aid. So it's absolutely fabulous. I can't recommend watching the programme enough. So they're about an hour each, and you
Right.
just felt very inspired by it. And what I was actually particularly impressed by was there was so it's all flashbacks, talking to people as they are now. It's shocking how much older they look, and then back to when the whole thing was going on, and it was back when the whole thing was going on, and Bob Geldof was being interviewed by a journalist, And the journalist said something about, don't you think, Bob, that the Ethiopian government ought to sort itself out and do X,
Mm.
Y, Z? And Bob Geldof said, it's not for us to tell countries how to run themselves. Our brief is to save lives, and that's all we're going to do. So I'm not going to get involved in talking about the government. And I just thought, there's a man ahead of his time, really, being able to respect other countries' choices, even though, we know that things go wrong. And well, we won't talk about the politics of Ethiopia and places like that. But anyway, I was very impressed.
Yeah, I suppose I got mixed feelings about that thought because I mean, as a kind of teenager of the time, a huge not no, not quite a teenager. We were a little bit older than that, weren't we? But
We
but
were,
but hugely positive about Live Aid because I think it captured a moment and the spirit of
yeah,
generosity of the British people, and everyone got behind a really urgent crisis and put their hands in their pockets and delivered some money. And it's a bit rich to criticize Bob Geldof in the moment for not solving the causes of the crisis as well as the crisis itself. So I can see why he would say that. At the same time, as a sort of charity chief executive and thinking about how do we solve the
yeah,
fundamentals of the problems we're seeking to address, then simply handing money over and assuming that everything will be fine again, of course, is never going to be the solution. And there's that song that came out the following year, I think, by the House Martins called Flag Day, which is worth a listen if people haven't heard it, because it is a good song, but it does annoy me because he, in the lyrics to that song, criticizes do-gooders and charity people for the stupidity of holding a jumble sale to help the poor, and says, try shaking your box in front of the Queen because her purse is fat and bursting at the seams. And you're sort of right, but at the same time, what is wrong with people raising a bit of money from time to time to do good for others, even if you can't solve the fundamentals, so long as we don't resile from acknowledging and understanding that putting band-aids, and they funnily enough, yeah, they called themselves band-aid, didn't they?
they
They
did,
weren't
yeah.
like they weren't hiding what they were doing. They
No,
were a band-aid. They were not solving the underlying illness. They were doing something in the short term because it was essential and life-changing for the people who are living in that moment. But yeah, on its own, it wasn't going to
yeah.
solve global poverty.
But it's interesting you say that, because actually the jumble sales and the fun runs and all those little things that people do add up to billions of pounds into the charitable sector by people. So I think it's all very well mocking the jumble sale, but all of those jumble sales together are saving lives, providing wheelchairs, providing beds for hospices, helping, keeping somebody out of trouble, helping somebody to rehabilitate. I mean, that's not funded by the Queen. It's not funded
No.
by the government primarily, and it's not funded by trusts and foundations. Most of the funding in the sector comes from individual human beings raising little pockets of money. So every little penny,
Yeah.
added up, aggregate, makes a massive difference.
I said often at the NSPCC that it was insufficient for us to dispense random acts of kindness to the small number of children who are fortunate enough to be touched by our services, and we had to amplify well beyond what we could do ourselves. And when I was at the Big Lottery Fund, I felt the same. I suppose I was most interested in the transformational grants that put
Yeah,
significant money into places with conditions attached to change the context around the spend. But Sir Clive Booth, who was my first chair
yeah,
at the Big Lottery Fund, he said to me, and I'll always remember it. He said that's fine, Peter, and that's okay, but don't forget that we are a source of small grants, small amounts of money to help people do the things which really matter to them, and there is an impact on the lives that are touched by those awards. Okay, it's only a small amount and it's only for a moment in time and it won't change things forever, but there is positive impact as a consequence of that sort of giving. And
Yeah,
if you mobilize and motivate people to hold a jumble sale or go on a fun run or whatever, and it gets them excited and interested and proud and feeling more philanthropic, then
yeah, that's a good thing.
there are other things to do, aren't there? So yeah, very wise man, Sir Clive.
Makes me think of the story of starfish, about the starfish, the little girl and the starfish. I mean, for listeners who haven't heard it, it's a very
Mhm.
famous story, so I expect
Yeah.
it's familiar to most. But it's about, so for the benefit of our listeners, it's about a little girl with her mum walking along a beach, and the tide has washed up a whole load of starfish onto the beach, and they're dying. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds, hundreds, if not thousands, of these things. So the little girl starts picking up the starfish and throwing them back into the sea. And the mother says, "What are you doing? You're not going to be able to save all the. You won't make a difference to these starfish." And the little girl who's got in her hand one starfish said, "No, I won't be able to save all of them, but I'll make a difference to this one." And even though it's an apocryphal story, I've always
Yeah.
loved that story about the fact that just because you can't save everyone doesn't mean you have an excuse to save no one, you know?
No, and then to argue it back the other way,
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to another pop song. I remember as an avid reader of the New Musical Express when I was in sixth form and wanting to be a rock star and being the kind of the school rebel. Um, U2 had a song called Rejoice, and there was a lyric in it which was, I can't change the world, but I can change the world in me if I rejoice. Now, I now think that's a good lyric, and but at the time I thought that was dreadful because I thought it
Yeah.
was really self-centered, limiting, just yourself, maybe one starfish. You can change the world
Which is also
with a will
true.
and a way. Get up and get on with it, especially if you've got the kind of reach and money that U2 ended up having. And they've done all sorts of things, haven't they, actually,
They
in
have.
philanthropic ways. I couldn't tell you how many marks out of 10 they would get for impact and the rest of it, but they've certainly been visible in that whole world
And you're
post
so
Band
right,
Aid.
because Bob Geldof was one individual who decided he needed to do something. It started with one person. So you're so right,
Yeah.
Peter. You don't have it. Was it Margaret Mead who said, if you think you're too small to change the world, try being in a bed with a mosquito.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
I
good.
think I think it was Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. Anyway, yeah. So I've been thoroughly enjoying it. So I recommend it to everybody. And also, it's sort of terribly interesting. The same week that Rachel D'Souza publishes the children's poverty. I can't remember the name of the report now, Peter. I don't know if you can remember what it's called. And the same week, the government issues its children's strategy. Just like the timing seems absolutely perfect. I'm sure it's entirely coincidental, of course, but quite shocking. I mean, I haven't had a chance to read in detail either the strategy or the report. I've only picked up the headlines, but I just wondered what you thought about all of this.
Um, yeah, so I confess, I haven't yet read the the government strategy. But that's about extending the family hubs, isn't it? I
Yeah,
think, and kind of reinventing Sure Start up the age range and joining services up with children at the centre, which has got to be a good thing in principle. I did see the headlines around Children's Commissioner's report talking about Dickensian conditions in
yeah,
which children are growing up and that sort of thing, and doesn't surprise me. I mean, Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done some really important work in this space for a considerable period, and one of the difficulties I think with child poverty is that the absolute numbers of children growing up in poverty are huge. There's something like a third of children, and that's very difficult for people to get their heads around, and quite
yeah,
easy for those who don't want to think about it to dismiss that because they look around. I cannot possibly see a third of the children in this country living in poverty, and the measures are relative rather than absolute. So as a
absolute.
country
Yeah,
gets richer, the numbers of children in poverty will rise if inequality is gap
yeah,
is widening. I think that's a legitimate measure, but Joseph Rowntree Foundation always track the numbers of children who are experiencing destitution, which is absolute poverty. So you're lacking the basic essentials: food, heating, hygiene, housing, clothing. And in 2022, there were 1 million children in the UK experiencing destitution, and that number,
Shocking.
yeah, and that number had doubled since 2019, and it had nearly tripled since 2017. So we haven't just got a relative poverty problem in this country; we have got an absolute child poverty problem, and so that is what Rachel D'Souza is picking up and reinforcing in her report. It's a scandal, and of course we don't. Many of us don't see too much of this because we're not knocking round the council estates and the high-rise blocks in other parts of the country. The numbers in
Not just
Scotland,
there either. There's lots of poverty in rural areas as well, isn't there?
yeah, and it can be caused by a number of reasons: worklessness, isolation, um,
It's in, yeah,
large
yeah,
families, of course. So a lot of the public debate has concentrated on the two-child limit,
yeah,
and that has certainly, in both absolute and relative terms, tipped many more children into
into poverty.
poverty
I
and destitution.
I remember reading some years ago, and I cannot for the life remember where I read it, but I remember, you may be familiar with it, but I remember reading that the poorer the family, the more children they're likely to have, and this is a global phenomenon. So the poorest countries tend to have much higher birth rates than richer countries, and that poorer people within richer countries tend to have more children than wealthier people do. And I've always found it really interesting. It's the poverty thing, Peter, is there are so many issues in our society that would be
Yeah,
resolved if we could do something about poverty. It
yeah,
causes mental
I,
health crises. It damages kids' education and future hope. It damages their physical health because they're not getting, the physical support and the quality of food and the quality of exercise that they need. It results in crime. It results in homelessness. I mean, it's like so many things can be pinned right back to the root cause of poverty. And yet it's still one of those things that people, why is that person, on benefits when, I've seen she's got an iPhone or what have you. And sort of sometimes I want to shake people and say, stop judging. Let's just bring people out of poverty. Let's bring
yeah,
everybody up to the right standard. I mean, we have, so as you know, I sit on the board of In Kind Direct, and I think I've talked about it before, but for those listeners who don't know, In Kind Direct is a charity that was set up to take excess product from companies and redistribute it to charities who were serving human beings. So things like Fairy Liquid, Pampers nappies, oh gosh, like you name it, like washing up liquid, washing powder, shower gel, that's
yeah.
as well as other, toys and things as well, and clothes and that sort of stuff. But anyway, we interestingly, we were sort of ticking along, and then we launched and got involved in this hygiene poverty campaign, which is talking about how many young people are struggling at school because they're not clean, because there's no money to buy soap or shampoo or deodorant. There's no money to buy period products, and anyway, we've been doing a lot of campaigning around this particular area. But of course, just that, young girls not having access to period products massively impacts on their ability to learn, on their confidence, on their socializing. If you're wandering around with an old towel in your knickers, do you know what I mean? How you're not going to feel confident, and you're not going
No.
to be open to learning and to listening and things like that. So yeah, it's just the one thing. Well, apart from the patriarchy, but we've got I haven't got enough time to talk about that. It's the P's, patriarchy and poverty. That's what we need to tackle. But if we could just do something about poverty, and it's not beyond the wit of man, Peter. Do you know what I mean? It's
Well, it's expensive, and we've just seen last week, that trying to reduce existing benefits in any part of the welfare system is struggling to get a
yeah,
majority
but
in
it's people not.
Parliament.
But
So
it's people not connecting the dots, isn't it, Peter? I mean, the reality is it costs more if you don't bring people out of poverty. It costs more on the NHS because people get ill and sick and they're hospitalised. It costs more in mental health services. You're more likely to have people ending up in a police cell. You're more likely to have people end up in crisis centres. You know, that's the problem. Is it actually costs more not to bring people up out of poverty, and that's the argument that has to be made.
And in one of the richest countries of the world, to have 1 million children experiencing destitution is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is another one of the, I don't know who said this originally. I've seen it attributed to me, which is definitely not true. And because I nicked it from Mark Russell, the chief executive of the Children's Society, and he may have nicked it from Gordon Brown. But this phrase that children are 20% of our population, but they're 100% of our future.
Yes,
it's a really
that's a
important line.
Phrase.
Yeah,
that's so important. 20% of the population and 100% of the future. That's fantastic.
Let's credit Mark Russell with that, because I know he listens to the podcast, and as I say, he is the person that I first heard use that line, and he can then pass on where he got it from, or he can say that he gave it to Gordon Brown. Who knows?
Yes, he can.
But it's
yeah. I've never looked at it like that before, but you're absolutely right. So yeah, it's infuriating, but that's why I'm so pleased about, you know, at the core of the government's. Well, I'm not pleased about cutting benefits, and I know that there's still a campaign going on about the 2-child cap, isn't there? But
yeah,
you know, the reintroduction of Sure Start, I think it's called Head Start now, or Best Start, something like that, isn't it? I think it's Head Start. Best start. That's it. The best start.
Best start in life was what Andrea Leadsom called it. So it's a kind of mishmash amalgamation of Sure Start and the best start in life to try and hopefully get some cross-party support behind it.
But the great thing is we know the model works. And we've mentioned this before on the podcast, so sorry, listeners, if I'm rehashing old ground, but they did the study, didn't they, to see the impacts of the Sure Start initiative 20 years on. And by any metrics, it was a phenomenal, outstanding success. So I'm just pleased that it got dumped, but now it's being reintroduced, and we already know that approach is impactful.
So this is the podcast to listen to if you only listen to one, but there is another podcast called Political Currency with Ed Balls and George Osborne on it, and they have been having a conversation in the last couple of weeks about if you had a spare billion or a couple of billion and you could only spend it on one thing, would you spend it on Sure Start, or would you spend it on lifting the 2-child cap? Which is it feels like a false choice, because we'd want to do both the sort of longer term, but it's an interesting. And George Osborne, he introduced the 2-child cap in the first place, and I think he's concerned there's too many big families. Although at the same time, quite a lot of people on the right think there aren't enough children. So that's a bit of I think it's the wrong people are having the children. That's talk about individual liberty.
I know.
And freedom of choice.
Yes, exactly. And because who was it? It was one of the ministers. Was it Bridget Phillipson or somebody said we need to have more babies?
Yeah.
And I think I posted on LinkedIn, no, we don't. There are 8.2 billion people on the planet. There are more than enough human beings to pay the taxes, to do the jobs, to contribute to the economy, you know, to do all the stuff. All we need to do, we don't need to force people to have kids. All we need to do is let more people in. And the people who say we need more babies, because it's the same. So they've got a population crisis in Japan, and I think in other parts of the Far East. And it's the same principle. It's like, it's not actually about not having enough people. There are plenty of people. It's about wanting to keep the purity, whatever the hell that means, of your particular, you know, the particular bit that you belong to. And it's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
And configuring the services to support the areas where the new babies are going to be. I'm like, you know. Yeah, it's just, and it's also the other thing, because I heard a piece this morning, but is when people say things like, if you're poor, don't have babies. It just makes me want to slap people. If you can't afford a child, don't have it. And yet the reality is that, firstly, what an ignorant thing to say. But secondly, like lots and lots of babies aren't planned. You know, they come into the world by accident, because of abuse, you know. It's like you can't circumstances change.
Exactly.
And it's absolutely no fault or consequence of the child in any event.
Yeah, it was. I mean,
which isn't to say that there isn't a job to be done, I think, around parental education and responsibility and awareness and curating the conditions in which parents who are having children can support them
yeah,
in a safe way. And children who are born into care very often are born into large families, and the parents want to look after the child, but recognize that they're incapable of doing so because they are living, chaotic lives because they've lacked the support to put them in a position where they can look after that child.
which is why
Yeah,
Sure Start, of course, was so
yeah,
successful, and why this Best Start, I think, is very encouraging. What do you call it? An initiative that isn't new? Because the root of the word initiative, isn't it? It's like
initiative.
it's
Yeah,
fresh, yeah. So
yeah.
it's not a re-initiative. Is that a word?
I
Or
used to,
initiative mark dot, mark two,
yeah, we used to get
son of
critic
initiative.
used to get criticized in kind of funder days for funders being too hooked on innovation
Yeah,
and new ideas. And
yeah.
someone said, the most innovative thing you could do would be carry on doing this thing that works.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It
Um,
drives small charities in particular absolutely up the wall. And of course, all that happens is charities totally lie to funders by repackaging what they're already doing and trying to make it look fresh, because you can't tell the truth. They know if they tell the truth and say this isn't new, but it does work and we need
yeah,
to keep funding. The other thing that really pisses off small charities is when they get money from a funder, but the funder says, how are you, or the question is, how are you planning to pay for this once our funding runs out? And it just makes people want to scream and shout with frustration. It's like, well, probably by asking more people for more money.
yeah.
It's like, it's just such a stupid question. Anyway,
Yeah, well, that's hard boiled into lottery law as well. You are required to say what happens at the end of the grant. And actually, that was part of the context of the conversation I had with Sir Clive Booth at the
yeah,
time. And he
yeah,
would be saying, well, what happens after this grant is that those people who have benefited from it in the short term will be that much more nourished and supported than they
yeah,
otherwise might be. So if nothing happens, yeah, it's a disaster. The purpose of the grant is not to sustain the charity forever, but hopefully you create and convince enough people around you that something more happens from somewhere else or the same funder. But you can't, if you spend your whole time in the award thinking about what you're going to do next, you won't do justice to the money you've already got.
and what you're trying to do now. It's
Yeah,
also, it's when people say things like charities don't have a God-given right to exist. And that kind of annoys me a bit, because all a charity is a vehicle for people to help other people, and other people do have a right to be offered support and help and to expect it. And so what happens is people separate charity, the word, from the recipients, from the beneficiaries, from the whatever you want to call them, from the human
yeah,
beings who that charity serves. And so it annoys me. I think charities do have a God-given right to survive, because they're there for a reason. They're not trying to make money.
yeah.
What they're trying to do is like save a child, or
So
support an environment,
yeah,
or
so long as they don't elevate themselves and their existence over the impact that
of
they're
course, yeah,
seeking to
absolutely,
have, and you do see that behavior, and I
you
think that's
do.
sometimes what people mean by uh, yeah,
Yeah, you do see it, but it's not that common. And even if they do, they're still serving somebody. It's like part of the problem is everybody expects charities to be superhuman, super perfect, super everything. We've got to be, not pay, take
yeah,
very as little pay as possible. We've got to like be humble and grateful and constantly kind and compassionate and polite.
yeah,
And, I've said this before, it just reminds me of the old Victorian, definitions of ladies. Keep your knees together, cross your ankles, don't show too much cleavage, don't laugh out loud, don't shout. It's like charities are treated very much in that, it
right.
presses all my buttons, my female button and my charity button when I hear things like that. So, yeah, so just remember, listeners, charities do have a right to exist because they're serving people, or most of them are. I could argue that actually some of them probably aren't.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And to go back to Bob Geldof, that's why what he said or one reason why what he said appealed to you, because he was concentrating on
On
making a
the
difference
Yeah,
in the moment in time on something which really mattered, and wasn't going to be distracted by someone saying, well, why aren't you solving this problem, that problem, and the other problem at the
yeah.
same time? Give me a
And
break.
Band-Aid, yeah, Band-Aid still exists, Peter, and actually
Yeah.
they don't have any staff at all at the moment. You know, that's administered and the money's distributed by a small group of trustees, which is so it goes back to that point of remembering the root of it. And I suspect I'm surprised they haven't got anybody paid helping them to do their work, actually, or maybe somebody's paying somebody. You know, maybe they're paying the accountant out of their own pockets. I don't know, but still
Yeah, I don't
stuck
know.
to the core principle.
I know Michael Grade is one of the trustees, and I think was at the time and is now, which probably is not good practice. But that longevity and
Yeah,
sustainability and kind of passion and commitment to something, yeah,
it's
it's
not to be
not to be
sniffed at.
dismissed. No,
And
it's
actually, somebody who's
something.
absolutely rooted to the purpose of the charity, which is about saving lives. You know, why would you want to lose? The trustees you don't want to lose off your board for sure are the visionaries, the ones who are really connected to the cause. The
Yeah,
others are all dispensable, you know, because you can get the person who you can get the city investment banker who thinks he knows about charity accounts. You know, they're two a penny. But finding someone who's got a really deep passion and commitment to your cause, that's quite rare. And I think we should hang on to those people. And on that note,
yeah.
I think we're done.
I need to knuckle down this week. I've got two big speeches coming out next week, which need to go very well. And if I work really hard tomorrow and on Friday, I can award myself a day at the Test match at Lord's on Thursday. So long as I get the first train and queue up with my MCC membership, which I haven't used once at all this season. So when you see those photographs of the little old men racing to get their seats in the
You're
pavilion
one of
on the
them.
TV on day one of the Test match, I will be one of them with my elbows, pushing them aside to get a decent seat.
It's been a lot of fun, actually, the test match, but we shouldn't bore our listeners with this. So we'll talk about that offline. Anyway, thank you
Very
very much,
good.
everybody, for listening. I say everybody optimistically, and see you next week.
Thanks very much. Bye.